The snow didn't just fall. It smothered. It came down in thick, silent sheets, burying the world in a shroud of white. The sky was the color of a day-old bruise, heavy and pressing down on what was left of the cabin. Just a skeleton of blackened timber. A place that once smelled of baking bread and pine smoke was now just ash, and a silence so deep it hurt your ears. Evelyn Hale knelt in the ruin of her life. Her skirt was stiff with frost. Her hands were raw, bleeding as she clawed at the soot, searching for something, anything. Her fingers finally closed around it, a small silver locket half buried in the grime. She brushed it clean. Inside, beneath the cracked glass, two faces smiled back at her, her husband, John, and their little boy, Sammy. She couldn't feel her fingers anymore. The cold had numbed them past the point of pain. All that was left was a strange, hollow calm. The kind that comes when you've screamed so much on the inside that there's nothing left. The wind moaned through the burnt beams, a lonely, whistling sound. Her own breath rose in a small white cloud, then vanished into the gray air. "I tried," she whispered to the emptiness. Her voice was a fragile thing, like an old prayer worn thin. "I tried to keep you safe." The words were swallowed by the snow. In the distance, a wolf pack sang to the dying light. The sound made her lift her head, not with fear, but with a weary sort of welcome. Death, she thought, would be a kindness now. Maybe it would come as sleep. Maybe it would be the weight of the snow, pressing her down until she just stopped. She almost hoped for it. And that's when she saw him. He emerged from the timberline like a ghost walking out of the storm. A figure immense and slow-moving, his breath a plume of white mist in the freezing air. He was bare-chested, even in the biting cold. A thick fur pelt was draped over his massive shoulders. His hair was long and white, spilling down his back like smoke. And the tomahawk at his side, the edge of it gleamed with something dark, something red. For a moment, Evelyn thought she was seeing a spirit, some ancient god of the mountain, come to finish the job that fate had started. But as he drew closer, she saw he was a man. Deep lines were carved into his face. A long, jagged scar ran from his temple all the way down to his jaw. And in his dark eyes, there was a sorrow that seemed as old as the mountains themselves. The wind shifted, carrying a faint metallic smell. Blood. Evelyn struggled to her feet, swaying, her voice cracked, sharp as ice. Did you do this?" The man said nothing. He just looked at her with those ancient, sorrowful eyes. Then he dropped something heavy into the snow at her feet. It was a leather pouch, tied with sinew. It rolled open, spilling its contents onto the white ground. 3 scalps. They were bound together with the copper buttons she had sewn onto her husband's coat just last winter. Evelyn staggered back, her hand flying to her mouth. The air left her lungs in a rush. She couldn't breathe. The faces of the raiders flashed in her mind. The cruel laughter as they set her home ablaze. The rough hands that dragged her out by her hair while her little boy screamed for her. She thought they had gotten away, vanished into the blizzard like demons, unpunished. But this man, this white-haired Apache warrior, he had hunted them. He had hunted them down through the storm. He stood over the grim offering without a hint of pride or malice. He just stood there, as if delivering vengeance was a simple duty, a chore that had to be done. Evelyn sank to her knees again, the strength gone from her legs. "Why?" she whispered, the word lost in the wind. "Why would you do this for me?" He watched her for a long time, his gaze unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough, like gravel shaped by wind and time. "They kill woman, child." He paused, his dark eyes boring into hers. Not right. The simplicity of it shattered her. The plain, unvarnished truth of his words broke through the dam of her grief. She clutched the locket to her chest and bowed her head, and the tears finally came. They fell silently, freezing into tiny crystals before they even touched the ground. The warrior watched her, his breath rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm, the only living sound in the white stillness. Then he stepped closer. His shadow fell over her. He pulled the fur from his own shoulders and draped it over her shivering body. The gesture was slow, careful, almost reverent, as if he was afraid she might break under his touch. "I don't want to live," she murmured, the words muffled by the thick fur. He tilted his head, his expression unchanging. "Then your child died twice." The words hit her like a physical blow. She looked up sharply, her lips parted to argue, to scream, but no sound came out. In the reflection of his dark eyes, she saw herself, a hollow, broken thing, a tiny flicker of life against a vast, indifferent canvas of snow. And deep inside her, something shifted, a tiny spark flickering to life under a mountain of ice. He turned toward the trees and gestured once with his head. An invitation. Or a command. She hesitated, clutching the heavy fur around her shoulders. The air between them felt fragile, charged with something she couldn't name. Then she followed. They walked until the black bones of her home were swallowed by the swirling snow. The storm was getting worse, the flakes coming down thick and fast, like falling ash. Her feet dragged. She stumbled more than once, her body screaming with exhaustion. But each time she fell, he was there, lifting her back to her feet without a word. Once she tried to thank him, but he just shook his head, a quick, sharp gesture, as if the sound of her voice would waste strength better spent on breathing. By dusk, the world had narrowed to the crunch of his steps in the snow ahead of her, the scent of pine, and something else, a faint trace of wood smoke on the wind. Her mind drifted, caught between the crushing weight of exhaustion and the sharp edges of memory. Sammy's laughter, the warmth of fresh bread, the way John used to hum while he mended fences, all gone, burned to ash and memory. Yet there was something in the old warrior's silence that felt steady, a presence that didn't demand anything, didn't offer false comfort. It simply endured. When the first lights of a cabin appeared between the trees, she almost wept with relief. A thin curl of smoke rose from a stone chimney, pale gray against the darkening sky. He pushed the heavy wooden door open, and it groaned in protest. The air inside was warm. It smelled of cedar and sage and drying animal skins. A fire was already crackling in the hearth. A carved wooden bowl of water steamed on a flat stone beside it. He had prepared this for her. She sank onto a pile of furs by the fire, her body finally giving in. He knelt nearby, stirring the coals with a stick, bringing the flames to life. For the first time, she saw his hands clearly. They were broad and covered in scars, but they trembled slightly as he handled an iron pot hanging over the fire. Not from weakness, she realized. From memory. He ladled a steaming broth into a wooden cup and offered it to her. She hesitated for a second, then took it. Her hand shook, sloshing the hot liquid over the side. The taste was sharp and wild, venison, herbs, and smoke. It burned a trail of warmth down her throat, chasing away the deep, numbing cold. She met his eyes across the flickering firelight. She wanted to ask his name, but something in his stillness stopped her. Names, she sensed, were not things to be given lightly. The wind howled outside, screaming through the pines. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks toward the rafters. He sat across from her, cross-legged, his eyes half closed. The shifting light made the scars on his chest look like rivers drawn on an ancient map, each one a story of survival. She finally found her voice, though it was barely a whisper. They took everything. He opened his eyes. They were dark and deep as a forest at midnight. Then take what left, he said, his voice quiet. breath, warmth, morning. The words were broken, but they were heavy with a truth she couldn't deny. She nodded, unable to speak. The silence that fell between them wasn't empty anymore. It was full of things unsaid, of a shared understanding that went deeper than words. Later, as sleep finally began to claim her, she watched him through heavy-lidded eyes. He moved to the doorway, a hulking silhouette against the swirling snow, scanning the forest. Then he returned to his place by the fire. His presence filled the small cabin, solid and immovable, like a mountain against the horizon. When she finally closed her eyes, she dreamed of her son's laughter, and for the first time since the fire, the sound didn't bring a fresh wave of pain. Sometime in the dead of night, she stirred. The storm had eased, and the only sound was the soft creak of the cabin as snow settled on the roof. He was still by the fire, but now he was chanting. It was a low, rhythmic sound, a language she didn't understand, but she could feel the meaning in her bones. A prayer to guide the dead, maybe, or to cleanse the living. Tears welled in her eyes again, but this time it wasn't from sorrow. It was from the quiet, stunning realization that this stranger, this ancient warrior, had carried the burden of her vengeance when she had nothing left. She whispered into the darkness, not sure if he could even hear her over the crackling flames. "Thank you." The chanting stopped. The old Apache turned his head slightly, his profile etched in firelight. He didn't speak. He just inclined his head once. A small gesture that felt like a blessing. Morning would come, cold and bright. She had no idea where her life would go from here. But as the flames flickered across his white hair, she understood one thing with a clarity that shocked her. She was no longer alone. But she was wrong. They were both alone. Together. And the danger she thought was over had only just begun to circle them in the snow. The morning light was pale and slow, the kind that touches the world without warming it. Evelyn woke under a thick buffalo hide, her limbs aching, but alive. For a long time she just lay there, listening. The pop of the fire, the sigh of the wind, the quiet, rhythmic sound of the man working. She turned her head. The Apache sat by the hearth, grinding herbs in a stone bowl. Steam rose from a pot beside him, clouding his face in a fine mist. His movements were patient, deliberate, as if he were performing an ancient ritual. He looked up when she stirred, and their eyes met across the small cabin. He gave a single, slow nod. No words. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It felt sacred, as if a single careless word could shatter something precious. She noticed her clothes, washed and neatly folded, resting by the door. She hadn't even heard him take them. He rose, the floorboards creaking under his weight, and handed her a wooden cup of broth. It smelled of venison and sage. "Thank you," she whispered. He just inclined his head and turned back to the fire. Her eyes wandered around the cabin, rough-hewn walls, bundles of dried herbs hanging from the rafters, carved animal bones above the doorway. Everything had a purpose. There was nothing for show. It was a place built for survival, not comfort. Yet she felt safer here than she had in her own home. He spoke suddenly, breaking the long silence. His accent was thick, his words chosen with care. "Name?" She hesitated for a second. "Evelyn." He repeated it quietly, tasting the syllables. "Evelyn." "And yours?" she asked, her voice soft. He poked the fire, watching the embers glow before he answered. "Tenzin." He pointed to the white streaks in his hair, then made a howling gesture. White Wolf. "Tenzin," she said, testing the name. A flicker of something, pride, maybe, crossed his face that she'd said it correctly. He set a small clay bowl next to her. Inside was a green, sharp-smelling paste. "For hurt," he said, gesturing to her hands. She looked down. The skin was raw and blistered from digging through the ash. When she hesitated, he reached for her hand. His touch was surprisingly gentle for a man with such rough, calloused palms. He carefully spread the salve over her wounds. His thumb traced a slow, deliberate circle over her knuckles. The sensation was so tender it was almost painful. She had to look away, her breath catching in her throat. "Your people," she murmured, her voice trembling. They don't mind you helping a settler?" He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was heavy with a quiet gravity. "Many dead. My people, yours. Snow no care what skin it cover." The words hung in the air between them, a truth so stark and simple it left no room for argument. She wanted to ask more, to understand the sorrow she saw in his eyes, but his posture, his stillness, warned her not to pry. He lived inside his silence, like other men lived inside their homes. Days passed in that quiet rhythm. The snow outside deepened, turning the world into a soft, white cage. He chopped wood, checked his traps, and cooked their meals in a companionable silence. She cleaned the cabin, mended his worn buckskins, and slowly, painstakingly, learned his words for water, for fire, for thank you. He, in turn, began to echo her words, shyly, like a child testing a new sound. One night, as she was patching one of his old shirts by the fire, she caught him watching her. It wasn't a look of pity or hunger. It was something quieter, older. As if he was looking at her and seeing another woman, from another lifetime, long buried under other snows. She quickly lowered her gaze, her needle suddenly seeming very important. The silence in that moment was so intimate it was almost unbearable. But everything changed the day the storm finally broke. She stepped outside for the first time in what felt like an eternity. The cold was a physical shock, stealing the air from her lungs. The forest glittered under a weak, watery sun, every branch coated in a thick layer of ice. Tenzin emerged from the cabin behind her. He was carrying a small bundle of sticks and herbs. He walked to a small clearing, just beyond the cabin. There, half buried in the snow, was a row of stones. 3 of them, carefully placed. Her heart seized in her chest. They were graves, for her husband, for her son, and for her, the woman he thought had died in the fire. He had brought their remains here. He had given them a resting place. She fell to her knees beside him, the cold seeping through her skirt. Tears froze on her lashes. "You did this." He nodded once, his eyes downcast. "They rest now." She covered her mouth with both hands, a sob catching in her throat. Gratitude felt like too small a word for what he had done. It felt inadequate, like trying to catch a river in a cup. She reached out, her hand trembling, and touched his arm. His muscles tensed under her palm, then slowly, they relaxed. For the first time, he didn't pull away from her touch. They stayed there for a long time, 2 broken people in the hush of the snow, caught in the same frozen breath of winter. That evening, the silence between them was different. It was no longer a wall, but a bridge. As they ate, she began to speak. Not all at once, but in broken fragments. She told him about Sammy's crooked smile, about the lullaby John used to hum, about the simple, quiet life they had built, and how it had all been turned to ash. He listened without interrupting, his gaze fixed on the fire. When her voice cracked and she had to stop, he simply poured her more broth, a silent urging to continue. "I thought God had forgotten me," she whispered, her voice raw. Tenzin's gaze lifted from the flames. His eyes were deep and steady. "Maybe God sends storm," he said softly. "Storm bring you here." The words sank into her, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. For the first time in months, she laughed. It was a broken, watery sound, but it was a laugh nonetheless. He didn't smile back, but the hardness in his eyes softened just for a moment, and she saw the man beneath the warrior. Later that night, as she lay on her side of the cabin, she watched the firelight dance across his face, turning his white hair to silver. He looked like something carved from the mountain itself, ancient and enduring. She whispered into the darkness, "You could have left me there." A long pause stretched in the quiet. Then his voice came, rough and honest. "No man leave life in snow." Her throat tightened. He had already closed his eyes, as if the words had cost him something. But there was something else in his voice she hadn't noticed before. A lie. A small one. But it was there. He wasn't telling her the whole truth. The next morning she rose to find him gone. A fresh pile of firewood was stacked by the door, and the pot of broth was warming by the fire, but the cabin felt unnervingly empty without him. She found his tracks leading away from the cabin towards the ridge. She followed them, her boots sinking into the deep snow. He was kneeling by the graves, chanting in his own tongue, but this time he wasn't alone. Another man stood with him, younger, with the same hard-carved face, but his eyes were filled with a cold fury. They were arguing, their voices low and sharp. She couldn't understand the words, but the tone was universal. Accusation. Anger. The younger warrior pointed a finger, not at Tenzin, but back towards the cabin, towards her, and that's when she saw it. Clutched in the younger man's hand was a small, leather-bound book, her husband's journal. She had thought it lost in the fire. But it wasn't. Tenzin must have found it, and he hadn't told her. The younger man saw her then. His eyes narrowed into slits of pure hatred. He spat on the ground and said something sharp to Tenzin, then turned and stalked off into the woods, disappearing as silently as he had come. Tenzin remained kneeling, his back to her. He looked smaller, somehow. Defeated. The silence stretched, heavy and cold. "What was that about?" she finally asked, her voice trembling. "Who was that? And why do you have my husband's journal?" Tenzin rose slowly and turned to face her. The sorrow in his eyes was so deep, it was like looking into a bottomless well. "That was my son," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "And he believes I have brought a ghost into our home, the ghost of the man who destroyed our people." Evelyn stared at him, her mind reeling. "What are you talking about? My husband, John. He was a good man." "He was a surveyor," Tenzin said, his voice flat and empty. "He worked for the railroad. He drew the maps that led them to the gold in our sacred mountains. The maps that led them to us." The world tilted under Evelyn's feet. It couldn't be true. John worked for a geological survey, mapping rock formations. He wouldn't. But the look in Tenzin's eyes told her it was the truth. "The men who attacked you," Tenzin continued, his voice dropping even lower. "They were not bandits. They were miners. The same men who drove my people from our land. The same men who killed my wife and my daughter. He had hunted them not for her, but for himself. And the man he had just saved was the wife of the man who had started it all. The snow around them suddenly felt like a cage, cold and unforgiving. The man who had saved her life was the man whose life her husband had helped to destroy. The vengeance he had delivered wasn't for her family, it was for his own. And now she was living in his home, a constant, painful reminder of everything he had lost. The air crackled with a tension that was colder than the frost. His son hated her. His people would see her as an enemy, and the man who had shown her such impossible kindness now looked at her as if she were the ghost of his own personal hell. The truth lay between them like a fresh grave, cold and deep. Evelyn's mind spun, trying to reconcile the image of her kind, gentle husband with the man Tenzin described. A man who drew maps that led to ruin. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "He wouldn't have. He didn't know." "He knew," Tenzin said, his voice devoid of emotion. He held out the journal. He wrote it all down. Her hands trembled as she took the small book. The leather was singed at the edges. She opened it to the last entry, John's familiar script blurring through her tears. They found the vein, bigger than they ever imagined. But it is on Apache land, sacred land. Kramer says it doesn't matter, that the survey maps will be adjusted. He says no one will ever know, but I know. God forgive me, I know. They are bringing in men to clear the territory, not soldiers. Something worse. Men who enjoy their work. I have to get Evelyn and Sammy out of here before they realize what I've done. Kramer. Deputy Ross Kramer. The man from the town. The man with the face carved from scorn. It all clicked into place with a sickening thud. The raid wasn't random. They weren't there for supplies. They were there to silence her husband, to get the original maps and the journal, and to eliminate any witnesses. They thought they had succeeded, but they hadn't counted on Tenzin. He was going to expose them, she said, her voice choked with a mixture of grief and a new, burning anger. He was trying to make it right. It is too late for that, Tenzin said. He turned and started back towards the cabin, his shoulders slumped. What happens now? She called after him. He stopped but didn't turn around. You should go. Go to the town. You are not safe here. And you? This has always been my home. I will not be driven from it again. The finality in his voice was like a door slamming shut. She spent the rest of the day in a daze, packing the few things she had into a small bundle. The warmth of the cabin now felt suffocating. Every glance from Tenzin was heavy with the weight of their shared, tangled history. The silence wasn't a bridge anymore. It was a chasm. He gave her a small pouch of dried meat and a water skin. His face was a stoic mask, impossible to read. The trail to the town is clear now, he said, his eyes fixed on some point over her shoulder. If you walk fast, you will make it by nightfall. She stood in the doorway, the cold air biting at her face. Tenzin. He finally looked at her. The sorrow in his eyes was a raw, open wound. I'm sorry, she whispered, for what my husband did. I'm so sorry. He just nodded, a single slow movement of his head. Then he turned his back on her and went to stare into the fire, leaving her alone in the doorway. She walked away from the cabin without looking back. Each step felt like a betrayal. She was leaving the man who had saved her, the man who had shown her a kindness she thought no longer existed in the world. But she was also the ghost of his past, a reminder of a pain that would never heal. The forest was quiet, the only sound the crunch of her boots in the snow. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every snap of a twig made her jump. She was halfway to the town when she saw them, 3 riders silhouetted against the setting sun. They were sitting on their horses on a ridge overlooking the trail, watching her. One of them was Deputy Kramer. Her blood ran cold. They knew she had survived. They knew she was alive. And they knew she had the journal. She ducked behind a thicket of pines, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was a loose end, and they were here to tie it up. She had nowhere to run. The town was still miles away. The forest was their territory. There was only one place she could go. Back to the cabin. Back to Tenzin. She turned and ran, her lungs burning, her feet slipping in the snow. She didn't know if he would help her. She didn't know if he would even let her back in. After all, she was the reason they were coming. But he was her only hope. The sun was bleeding across the horizon when she stumbled back into the clearing. The cabin was dark. The fire had been put out. He was gone. Panic seized her. He had left. He had abandoned her. Then she saw the tracks. Not his. The tracks of shod horses. They had been here. They had come for him while she was gone. A wave of despair washed over her. She was too late. She pushed open the cabin door, a sob catching in her throat. The inside was a wreck. Furs overturned, pottery smashed. They had been looking for something. For her. For the journal. And then she saw him. He was lying in the corner, half hidden in the shadows. There was a dark stain spreading across the floor beneath him. She rushed to his side, her hands fluttering over him, not knowing what to do. He was alive, his breathing shallow and ragged. There was a deep gash on his forehead, and his side was soaked with blood. "Tenzin," she cried, her voice breaking. He opened his eyes. They were clouded with pain. "They came," he rasped, "looking for you, for the book." "I have it," she said, pulling the journal from her pack. "It's safe." A faint, grim smile touched his lips. "Good." "We have to stop the bleeding," she said, tearing a strip of cloth from her skirt. "No time," he whispered, his eyes drifting towards the door. "They will be back." As if on cue, a voice bellowed from the darkness outside. "We know you're in there, Hale, and we know you've got the woman. Send her out, and we might let you live." It was Kramer. Evelyn's heart leaped into her throat. They were trapped. Tenzin was wounded, maybe dying, and a posse of killers was right outside the door. She looked at Tenzin, his face pale in the gloom. His hand was resting on the handle of his tomahawk. Even now he was ready to fight. She thought of his words. No man leave life in snow. He hadn't left her. He had stayed. He had fought for her, for the wife of the man who had wronged him. A fierce, protective anger rose up inside her, chasing away the fear. They would not have him. They would not win. She grabbed Tenzin's hunting rifle from the wall. Her hands were surprisingly steady as she checked the load. "Go behind," Tenzin breathed, trying to push himself up. She pushed him gently back down. "No," she said, her voice hard as steel. "This time I fight with you." She moved to the window, peering out into the moonlit clearing. She could see them, 5 of them, moving through the trees, their rifles glinting in the pale light. They thought she was a helpless widow, a frightened woman. They were about to find out how wrong they were. The night exploded. A rifle shot splintered the wood of the doorframe, inches from Evelyn's head. She didn't flinch. She raised Tenzin's heavy rifle, sighted down the barrel, and fired. A man cried out in the darkness and fell. Kramer's voice roared from the trees. "You'll pay for that, you witch!" Another volley of shots peppered the cabin. Wood splintered. Pottery shattered. Evelyn ducked down, reloading as fast as her trembling fingers would allow. "The floor!" Tenzin rasped from the corner. "Under the furs!" She crawled to the center of the room and pulled back the thick buffalo hide. There was a loose floorboard. She pried it up. Underneath was a hidden compartment. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a pistol and several boxes of cartridges. And something else. A bundle of sticks with oily rags tied to them. Arrows, with a deadly purpose. "My son, he did not want a settler woman to have them," Tenzin breathed. "But the spirits must have known." The irony was bitter, but there was no time to dwell on it. She checked the pistol, a solid, heavy Colt, and tucked it into the waistband of her skirt. She crept back to the window. The men were getting bolder, moving from the cover of the trees into the clearing. They thought they were facing a lone, wounded man. She fired again. Another man went down, clutching his leg. They were angry now, their shots more wild, more desperate. "Burn them out!" Kramer yelled. A torch arced through the air, landing on the dry tinder of the roof. The flames caught instantly, licking up the side of the cabin with a hungry roar. Smoke began to fill the small space, thick and acrid. Evelyn's eyes burned. She coughed, the rifle feeling heavier and heavier in her hands. "We have to go," she said, her voice tight with panic. Tenzin was struggling to sit up, his face a mask of pain and determination. The back wall, a loose log. They crawled through the choking smoke. The heat was becoming unbearable. The roar of the fire was a deafening monster. Tenzin used his knife to pry at one of the logs at the base of the wall. It groaned, then shifted, opening up a small gap to the night outside. "Go!" he urged, pushing her towards the opening. "Not without you!" she coughed, grabbing his arm. He was a dead weight, but she pulled, her muscles screaming in protest. Together, they squeezed through the opening, tumbling out into the snow just as the roof of the cabin collapsed in a shower of sparks and flame. They were exposed. Kramer and his remaining 2 men saw them immediately. They raised their rifles. But Tenzin was ready. Even wounded, he was faster than them. An arrow hissed from his bow, a dark streak against the snow. It found its mark in the chest of one of the men. Kramer fired wildly. The bullet tore through the fleshy part of Tenzin's arm. He grunted in pain but didn't fall. Evelyn raised the pistol. The kick of it surprised her, jolting her arm. Her shot went wide. The last of Kramer's men was taking aim at Tenzin. There was no time to reload the rifle, no time for another arrow. Evelyn didn't hesitate. She ran straight at him, screaming a wordless cry of rage. The man was so surprised he fumbled his shot. She slammed into him, the journal clutched in her hand like a weapon. They went down in a tangle of limbs. He was strong, his hands like iron vices, closing around her throat. Black spots danced in front of her eyes. She clawed at his face, her nails digging into his skin. Then, a shadow fell over them. It was Tenzin's son, Koda. He stood there for a heart-stopping second, his face a storm of conflicting emotions. He looked from the burning cabin to his wounded father, to the woman his father had saved, the woman he hated, now fighting for her life. The man beneath Evelyn grinned, his grip tightening. "Help me, boy. She's the one who brought this curse on us." Koda looked at Evelyn. He saw the fire in her eyes, the fierce, desperate will to live. He saw the journal clutched in her hand, the truth, and in that moment, he made a choice. He drew the knife from his belt, and with a guttural cry, he plunged it into the back of Kramer's man. The man's grip went slack. He slumped to the side, his eyes wide with surprise. Only Kramer was left. He stood alone in the clearing, a wild, cornered look on his face. He stared at Tenzin, at Koda, at Evelyn. He was outnumbered, defeated. He raised his hands. "All right," he snarled. "You win." He started to lower his rifle, but it was a trick. In one fluid motion, he swung the rifle towards Evelyn. A shot rang out, but it wasn't from Kramer's gun. It was from the pistol in Evelyn's hand. She had fired from the ground, without even taking aim. Kramer staggered back, a look of shocked disbelief on his face. He clutched at his chest, a dark stain spreading across his shirt. He fell to his knees, then pitched forward into the snow, his badge glinting in the light of the burning cabin. Silence descended on the clearing, broken only by the crackle of the flames. The fire had taken her first home. Now it had taken her second. But this time, she wasn't alone in the ashes. Koda rushed to his father's side, speaking to him in their own tongue, his voice thick with concern. Evelyn got to her feet, her body trembling with adrenaline and exhaustion. She looked at the bodies in the snow, at the inferno that had been her sanctuary. She had faced death and had not blinked. She had taken a life to save a life. She was no longer just a widow. She was a survivor, a warrior. Tenzin looked at her, then at his son, and a faint smile touched his lips. He reached out and took her hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "The storm," he whispered, his voice weak but clear. "It brought you home." Koda looked at their joined hands, and for the first time, the hatred in his eyes was replaced by something else, a reluctant respect, an understanding. The snow began to fall again, soft and gentle, covering the blood and the ash, washing the world clean. The 3 of them stood there in the quiet clearing, surrounded by the ghosts of the past and the uncertainty of the future. The cabin was gone. Their sanctuary was gone. But they had each other, and for now, that was enough. The journey that followed was a fever dream. Kokanai, The younger warrior who had been with Coda appeared from the trees. He had been watching, waiting. Together, he and Coda fashioned a crude travois, and they carried the wounded Tenzin through the snow-draped forest. Evelyn walked beside them, the heavy rifle in one hand, John's journal clutched tight in the other. Adrenaline had given way to a bone-deep weariness, but she refused to stop. They traveled for a day and a night, moving deeper into the mountains, to a place the maps didn't show. They came to a hidden valley, a narrow cleft in the rock protected by ancient pines. It was a village, not of cabins but of wickiups, nestled into the landscape so perfectly they were almost invisible. Smoke curled from hide-covered openings, and the air smelled of sage and roasting meat. This was Tenzin's home. What was left of it? The people who emerged were wary. Their faces were etched with hardship and loss. They looked at Evelyn, the white woman, with suspicion and fear in their eyes, but they looked at their wounded elder with reverence. They carried Tenzin to the largest wickiup, the shaman's lodge, and laid him on a bed of soft furs. For days, Evelyn was an outcast. She sat outside the lodge, refusing to leave, while the shaman worked his medicine inside. Coda brought her food and water, his face a mask of grim duty. He wouldn't meet her eyes. She was a ghost here, a symbol of the world that had tried to erase them. One evening, Coda sat down across the fire from her. "My father is strong," he said, his voice low. "He will live." "I know," she replied. The silence stretched between them. "You fought," he said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. "Like one of our own." "I fought for my life, and for his." He nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the flames. "The men who followed you, they are the reason my mother and sister are dead. They are the reason we hide in this valley like rabbits." He finally looked at her, his eyes burning with an intensity that startled her. "This journal you carry, it is the truth?" "It's my husband's confession," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "And it's the evidence that can bring them all down." The story spilled out of her then, about the mining company, about the adjusted maps, about Kramer and his greed. Coda listened, his expression unreadable. When she was finished, he stood up. "The elders will want to see this," he said. The next day she was summoned before the council. 3 old men, their faces like ancient maps, sat in the center of the lodge. Tenzin was there, propped up against a pile of furs, his face pale but his eyes clear. She told her story again, and with Coda translating, she read the damning passages from John's journal. When she was done, the lodge was silent. The elders murmured to each other in their own tongue. Finally, the oldest of them spoke, his voice like the rustle of dry leaves. Coda translated. "He says your husband's spirit is a troubled one, but his final act was one of honor. He says you carry his honor now. You have shed blood with us. You are no longer an outsider." Tears welled in Evelyn's eyes. She had lost one family, but in the most unlikely of places, she had found another. But their fight was not over. The mining company was still out there. They had killed Kramer's posse, but the men who paid them were still powerful, and they would not stop until they had the silver and had silenced anyone who stood in their way. "They will send more men," Tenzin said, his voice weak but firm. "They will not stop until they have this valley." "Then we cannot wait for them to come to us," Coda declared, his voice ringing with a newfound authority. "We must take the fight to them." A plan was formed, a desperate, dangerous plan. They would use John's journal and his original maps to expose the company. But they couldn't just ride into the nearest fort. The company's influence ran deep. They had to get the evidence to someone who couldn't be bought. A territorial judge in Santa Fe. It was a journey of hundreds of miles through hostile territory. "I will go," Coda said. "You will not go alone," Tenzin said, looking at Evelyn. And so, a week later, a small party set out from the hidden valley. Coda, the young warrior seeking justice for his people, and Evelyn Hale, the widow seeking redemption for her husband's sins. Tenzin stood at the edge of the village, watching them go. He had given Evelyn a small, carved wooden bird. For freedom, he had said. Their journey was perilous. They were hunted. Men from the mining company, led by a ruthless tracker, were on their trail. There were close calls, ambushes in narrow canyons, and desperate chases across the open plains. But Evelyn was no longer the woman who had knelt, broken, in the ashes of her home. She had learned to read the land, to move silently, to shoot with a steady hand. She and Coda fought side by side, their shared purpose forging a bond between them stronger than blood. They finally reached Santa Fe, ragged and exhausted. They found the judge, a hard, honest man who listened to their story with a growing sense of outrage. He looked at the journal, at the maps. He saw the truth. Justice came swiftly. The U.S. Marshals descended on the mining operation. The company bosses were arrested. The treaty protecting the Apache land was honored. Evelyn and Coda returned not as fugitives, but as heroes. The day they arrived back in the valley, the entire village was there to greet them. There was a feast, a celebration that lasted late into the night. Evelyn found Tenzin sitting by his fire, watching the stars. He looked older, but the deep sorrow in his eyes had been replaced by a quiet peace. She sat down beside him. For a long time, they said nothing, just watching the flames dance. "You have brought honor to your name, Evelyn Hale," he said softly. "I just finished what my husband started," she replied. He reached out and took her hand. His palm was rough and scarred, but his touch was gentle. "John Hale's spirit can rest now," he said, "and so can yours." He pulled 2 eagle feathers from the pouch at his side. They were tied together with a strip of deerskin. "In my way," he said, his voice low and solemn. "Fire see truth. Sky hear promise. You stay, I stay." Her throat tightened. It was a proposal, a vow. She nodded, unable to speak. He tied 1 feather to her wrist, the other to his own. They knelt before the fire, the light flickering across their faces. He murmured something in his own tongue, a prayer woven with wind and smoke. When he finished, he looked into her eyes. "Now, you are my home." Evelyn smiled through her tears. "And you are mine." Far above them, a hawk circled once in the vast, starry sky, then vanished into the night. The ghosts of the past had finally been laid to rest, and in the heart of the mountains, under the watchful eyes of the ancestors, a widow and a warrior began to build a new life, not from ashes and sorrow, but from courage and honor and love. It was a story of revenge and a story of redemption. A story that proves that even in the coldest, darkest winter, a single spark of hope can be enough to start a fire that warms the world. What did you think of Evelyn's journey? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales from the shadows of history.